I want to give everybody a quick welcome to our December Produce Safety Educators call. Thank you all so much for joining. We realized that it was a relatively short invitation, but we were just really excited to get this topic out there and talk to everybody about the FSMA Traceability Rule. And let's see, I see that the numbers joining have started to slow down. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Donna Clements with the Produce Safety Alliance, and I am here with a couple of panelists, Don Steckel, also with the Produce Safety Alliance, and Angela Fields with the Food and Drug Administration, to talk a little bit about the FSMA Traceability Rule. And what we're really targeting today are discussing supplemental slides for grower outreach. We know that a lot of you have PSA grower trainings coming up in the winter or other types of grower outreach. And we've been receiving a lot of questions from PSA trainers and other educators about the new traceability rule, how it might apply to farmers, and asking if we are developing any outreach materials for this new rule. So we wanted to take the chance and schedule something right before the holidays, right before all of the winter trainings jump off, and schedule something to talk about traceability. So that's what this call is today. Jumping right into it, a couple of instructions as usual with the educators calls. Everybody is muted. However, we do have some time for discussion and asking questions throughout the presentation. So if you want to be unmuted, there's a ask to unmute button and you can select that. Otherwise, you can ask questions in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll be making sure to address those questions written in the chat box as well. And as well as throughout the presentation, we will be saving some time for questions and discussion at the end of the meeting. As normal, this session is recorded and the presentation will be shared via the listserv and on our website after the call. I know a number of people today were really interested in attending, but because it's so close to the holidays, they couldn't make it work with their schedule. So this information will be available on the Produce Safety Educators Call website. And then I also want to give this reminder that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect legal advice, views, or positions of the PSA and its members, nor any entities they represent. So I wanted to give a quick overview for today's webinar. We are going to start with a couple of introductions, primarily introducing the scope of today's call and what we're really trying to get out of today's webinar. Then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Don Steckel with the Produce Safety Alliance to preview some draft FSMA Traceability Rule supplemental slides. And then we're going to discuss those supplemental slides because we wanted to preview them for you all attending and ask for your input before we finalize them and add them to the website. See what kind of questions you have. And then lastly, we're going to wrap things up with a quick toast to the new year and some other PSA updates. And I want to give a quick reminder for today that when I say, or when we're previewing these supplemental slides on the traceability rule, this is a brand new regulation. It is new to all of us, and kudos to everybody who sat down and read the 600 or so pages, including the preamble, because there's a lot of material there. I know PSA has had one long call so far discussing the ins and outs of the rule and how it might apply to growers. And I just want to remind you that these draft slides may be adapted based on today's conversation. If you have questions, the types of questions that you have. And this presentation is really meant to be a preview to obtain further feedback from educators and other partners. And really it's intended to keep this conversation moving forward. I think as the compliance dates come down the line in a few years, I would hope in a few years we have a better understanding of what this means for growers, but this is hopefully the start of many conversations where we're just trying to improve outreach and education for growers and keep these materials moving forward. And then based on today's feedback and the questions we receive, the final slides will be posted to the PSA website for use as soon as possible. And when we add them to the website, we will let you know via the Produce Safety Educators Call listserv. And with that, I want to welcome our third panelist today. From the Food and Drug Administration, we have Angela Fields, and she is here today to help address questions about the Food Traceability Rule. Just a reminder, this is new, and I think we're all still trying to internalize and understand what exactly this regulation means for growers, but Angela is here to help answer some of the questions that you might be asking today. And I do want to relate to you here that the FDA has not reviewed or approved the PSA draft supplemental slides that you are seeing today. Angela is really just here to help answer some of the questions that might come up. But there are two industry-wide briefings that I want to highlight for you that FDA has provided, and they are both posted online. Tommy, I believe, is going to drop those links in the chat box. If you all want to see a very thorough industry-wide briefing from FDA, there is the stakeholder call from the 15th of November, and there was a December 7th webinar that also had a lot of question and answer to it. So those will be resources for you, and they're in the chat box. Okay, so before I turn this over to Don to preview the supplemental slides, I wanted to show you right up front the types of questions that we are going to ask you to provide input on when we ask you about the supplemental slides. So we're going to ask these questions at the very end, but as you're reviewing these and hearing Don present these slides, keep some of these questions in mind. So the first is, what is needed in these supplemental slides? I expect a lot of PSA trainers might opt to include some of these supplemental slides in Module 7 when we talk about traceability during the PSA Grower Training Course. And I also expect a lot of growers are going to be using these slides to provide updates to farm-oriented audiences. So keep in mind that for those audiences, what is needed in these slides? Keep in mind, is there anything missing? This is not a comprehensive slide set because, again, it's a very long regulation. It's really just a primer to introduce some of the vocabulary in the rule. And I just want to highlight that it is not comprehensive. And then the last question we're going to ask you is, should anything be adjusted? Do you see anything that's confusing? And we are going to highlight from the farm perspective, so growing or packing perspective when we go through these slides. Okay, and with that, I am going to turn it over to Don Steckel.
I suppose it would help if I turn mute off, as if we're not all used to turning off mute and working in Zoom. It's great to see everybody. It's been a while since I got to represent PSA in a webinar, so thank you for joining, and thanks for the feedback that several of you have given as we developed this slide set and tried to make some short, useful, to the point information that's going to help growers, to help farmers understand what's important in the traceability rule for them. We'll start with Stoltzfus's question. Thank you, Jeff, for kicking it off. Oh, nope. If you could go back. The introductory slide, it's so packed with information that even the introductory slide has information. Jeff asked, is this part of FSMA? So you can see that this is part of FSMA, section 204. People still refer to it as FSMA section 204. If someone wants to look it up, though, they will go to 21 CFR Part 1, Subpart S. That's where they'll find that information. So as always, we have included not just the information on the slides, but also in the notes. That information is in the notes. Now, please, Donna, thank you. First thing on, well, yeah, I think the first thing on a lot of people's minds, when? January 20th, 2026 is going to be the compliance date for this rule. And if you really wanted, and so pardon me for backing up, I'm going to go through this in train the trainer mode. So not exactly as you would present it to growers, but rather I just want to describe to you what's in these slides. So this is, of course, very important for people to understand. January 20th, 2026 is the compliance date for those who are covered. You can give more information about where people can find the information, of course, as you presented this slide. on this slide, the notes also can contain some of the links for people, and also a quote that points out for anybody who followed the evolution of the traceability rule. The quote is that the reasons why FDA extended the compliance date period from the proposed 2 years to the actual 3 years. So if somebody asks that question of a trainer, you can go into the notes and you can read the quote from the preamble to the traceability rule, and not tell somebody read through 599 pages to find the one that you're looking for. So we're just trying to help people out there. Go on to the next slide, please. The second question after when is compliance date that most people are going to ask is, well, do I have to worry about this? So that's the point of this slide. So many people listened to the detailed industry-wide presentation that was 4 hours of FDA sharing for the entire industry. What about this traceability rule? What we've done is we've pulled out the things that are most relevant to growers and packers, in other words, farms, that we're in front of as part of PSA Grower Training Courses. So you remember the concept of covered activities. The covered activities in the traceability rule are manufacturing, processing, which are activities that are typically done at facilities or farm mix type facilities, but also packing and holding, which can be done at farms. So some farms will be covered if they pack or hold foods that appear on something called the Food Traceability List. So that's an important concept, is that Food Traceability List. We're going to get to that. Before we get to that, though, I want to make sure I'm very clear on this, is why I took a pause. The exemptions and exclusions and coverage status of produce safety rule are mirrored by the traceability rule. If you are excluded from if you are excluded from the produce safety rule because of the 25K limit indexed to 2011, then you're also excluded from the traceability rule. If your produce is rarely consumed raw and therefore it is excluded from the produce safety rule, it's also excluded from the traceability rule. The exception is there is no qualified exemption in the traceability rule. There are some exemptions that are part of the traceability rule, for instance, direct sales to the consumer. Many of them are similar to, and they cover some of the same territory as a produce safety rule qualified exemption. But our current understanding is that farms that have a PSR qualified exemption from most requirements of the produce safety rule may still be required to provide traceability information, if they're covered by traceability rule, for their non-qualified end users. In other words, their distributors, their wholesalers. So that's an important thing for farms to know. Then we get into a couple of things that are in addition to the produce safety rule exemptions and exclusions that are mirrored in the traceability rule. Remember here the difference between packing and packaging. Packaging is the consumer unit. So if an item is packaged at the farm in a way that it is protected from contamination and the packaging remains in place to the consumer, there's specific wording in the traceability rule that allows that product to be exempt from the traceability rule. There are also provisions for waivers in the traceability rule that can be either applied for or for FDA at their own initiative to apply. And finally, rather than the flow chart that we all know and love for the produce safety rule and for the draft traceability rule, FDA has come up with an exemptions and exclusions tool that helps people to understand whether their operation is exempt or excluded from the traceability rule. Should we pause there? Donna, what do you think? Donna's on mute, but she says, yes, that's an excellent idea, Don. How did you get so smart? Does anybody want to stop and just talk about exemptions and exclusions, because that's so important to our growers?
There is a question in the chat box that I'll read out. So do I understand correctly that traceability exempt direct sales are all sales that are to produce safety rule qualified end users?
I'm going to give Angela a chance to speak with the definitive. Otherwise, I'll punt and give my best understanding. Angela, would you like to are you familiar enough with what Dan is asking about the PSR, qualified end users?
So I am not familiar with the qualified end users. Could you expand a little bit more for the direct sales portion of it as well?
Yep. So Angela, a qualified end user under the produce safety rule is the consumer of the commodity of the product or a retail food establishment or restaurant that is within 275 miles or the same state or the same Indian reservation.
Okay. So yes, direct sales to any consumer, direct sale from a farm is going to be exempt. So the idea behind that being that a lot of the packaging will already have a lot of the information about the farm already on there. So it'll be easy for us to figure out who that was. And then additionally, the component of, because it's a shorter supply chain and we're talking about somebody that would basically know whom they received it from, we didn't feel that it was necessary for us to collect additional records for that, because again, we would be able to go to the person who received the product and ask them where they purchased it from, which then would put us back to the farm.
And Dan, I'll just add on that because I know where you're coming from. It's not a direct one-to-one. And in many ways, the traceability rule is more encompassing because it doesn't have that 275-mile limit to it. And the traceability rule also has a different exemption for certain farm to school pathways, sales pathways, that's not part of, that may or may not be counted as qualified end users. So they don't actually map one-to-one. And Betsy makes the point that the packages that, and as part of Angela's response, we're making an assumption here that the packages are labeled and include the farm name and address, which of course under the modified labeling exemptions for the produce safety rule, they would be for qualified end users.
And to respond to that point, I do want to say that whether or not a firm is a part would be covered under FSMA 204, you still will be maintaining your subpart J information as well. So I do want to note that there are still going to be pieces of data that are available based on whatever you have to do to comply with subpart J, which is the Bioterrorism Act. So there's still that expectation, and 204 kind of builds on that.
So Angela, in the case where a raw agricultural commodity is not packaged, it's sold bulk, and so it's not going to have the packaging label on it, is that also exempt if it's sold to a restaurant?
If it's sold directly to a restaurant and it's bulk product, then I believe we are still going to have that be exempt, because again, that's still a direct sale. But that is something that I can circle back on. I know we went back and forth a lot on how to deal with bulk commodities, because of course we were concerned that there is no packaging and wanting to make sure that we were able to obtain the right information. So let me double check on that, and then I'll get back to you all.
Great. And then Kristen just wants to confirm that the traceability rule does not include that 275-mile radius. That's a key part of the Tester-Hagen amendment to produce safety rule.
Right, it does not. All of our exemptions are based on sales and size.
Excellent, thank you. So great to have somebody live from FDA who's able to answer all those questions. What a relief for me. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we're still on exemptions, exclusions in a sense. Actually, we're not on exemptions, exclusions, we're on coverage, because what we had were farms who were manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding things that are on the food traceability list. So things that are on the food traceability list are the raw agricultural commodity forms of cucumbers, fresh herbs, leafy greens, melons, peppers, sprouts, tomatoes, and certain a definition of tropical tree fruits. It's not so we've got all that. That's not all that's on the food traceability list. These are the ones that we put on this slide because we thought they were the most useful for growers, because the growers and packers are selling raw agricultural commodities. If they slice and dice, then they're a facility. So that's why we did not put fresh cut fruits and vegetables, which are also on the food traceability list. So in the notes, I referenced the perimeter around tropical tree fruits as one example. You can see that tropical tree fruits does not include avocados or citrus or pineapples and bananas. So it's one of those things where this word may not mean what you think it means. And that's why we went ahead and put the full definition or the full listing of what is a tropical tree fruit, along with melons. And I guess it was just those two. Well, we put them all into the notes so that you wouldn't be stumbling during an actual presentation of these slides. Does anybody have questions about what commodities are covered? Again, these are the raw agricultural commodity versions, any variety of these raw agricultural commodities. In addition, things that would be maybe tangentially relevant to a farm, fresh cut fruits and vegetables, tree nuts that are going to butters, and then a lot of other processed, minimally processed and non-produce items, like some dairy items, some seafood items. So this isn't a comprehensive list. Again, just wanted to underscore what we're doing is we're pulling out the things that are most important to farms. Questions about the FTL, food traceability list? I'm going to just pause for a second. No, Jeff asks, no small fruit tree fruit. Yes, if I've interpreted your question right, Jeff, that's something like apricots would not be. I think that an apricot would be a small fruit tree fruit, is not on that list. Okay, I'm going to move on, and we can always, we'll cover the rest of it later. Again, we're hoping to get across the things that your farms need to know. Here's where we get into the alphabet soup. The food traceability list, really important. It's that list of foods that are covered under the traceability rule. Something called critical tracking events. So these are probably equally as important as those covered activities of manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding. If an operation that's covered by the traceability rule is harvesting, cooling before initial packing, doing the initial packing of the product, shipping, receiving, or transforming the product, where transforming includes things like repacking, then those are critical tracking events, and those are going to have requirements under the traceability rule. So that's really important. How are these things all tied together? We've got the traceability lot code. Something that's really important for everyone to understand is the initial packing. That's where the traceability lot code is assigned for a raw agricultural commodity on the food traceability list. So it's where the TLC is assigned for the RAC on the FTL. But that's more or less the entry point to the rule. So that's where things start. Sometimes that initial packer, we believe, needs to reach back and get information about, well, we'll talk about that later, about harvest and cooling, and then passes forward information. What information do they need to provide? Well, those are called key data elements. So those are the records within the critical tracking event that are listed in the traceability rule that must be collected and held. And then, important to our farms, the location description is going to be the business name, the contact information, and the location, either an address or a GPS, where the critical tracking event occurred. Angela, did I get that right? Okay, good. So let's move on. Clear that screen. There we go. If an operation is covered by the traceability rule, they're going to have a traceability plan. That's the first thing. That traceability plan is well, it's the plan. How are you going to do this? It's going to include procedures for identifying covered foods. Again, how does the operation know that the commodity, that it is tracking appropriately all the commodities that are on the food traceability list. And this is more or less a reminder that the covered operation is going to be manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding. Notice that harvest and growing have key data elements associated with them, but they may not be technically covered by this particular rule. Within that plan, there's going to be a description of how TLCs, how traceability lot codes are created for farms, especially invaluable for us for farms that are growing fresh produce racks that are on the food traceability list. There will be a map that gives the location and name of each field so that in subsequent steps, the key data elements can include information like Smith Farm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Field A. And that will be linkable to a map that says Field A is this particular field, and that's where this was grown. Important here is the also the GPS, the location, the coordinates for that field. Point of contact for the traceability plan, and then the procedures for maintaining records, because records. That's what this one's all about. So let's go on. The records are all tied together with something called traceability lot codes for raw agricultural commodities on the food traceability list. So that traceability lot code is going to be assigned not in the field, not during harvest, unless it's field packed. The initial packer is going to assign the traceability lot code to what's called the traceability lot. The rule does not give specific requirements for how to make a traceability lot code. It just says this is what is a traceability lot code, and there's some information about some of the characteristics of a traceability lot code. But in several parts of the preamble, FDA has said that they are going to remain agnostic. Yes, I can never remember that word. Somewhat agnostic about how the goals of the rule are accomplished. That traceability lot code links up the critical tracking events, including harvesting and cooling, if the cooling is done before packing, the initial packing, and then other events before that commodity reaches the consumer. Again, the recorded information that goes along with the critical tracking elements is referred to as key data elements, and those key data elements are what we're going to talk about in the next two slides. So let's go through the next two slides and then take another pause. The key traceability element, key data elements that happen before initial packing may or may not be done by an operation that is actually covered by the traceability rule. You'll notice growing is not on this list. The grower, if they are covered by the traceability rule, will have a traceability plan that includes their farm map. The harvester is the operation that's going to take that information and the key data elements that the harvester is going to collect during the harvest process are where was it grown, the name of the field that was harvested, the location description of the recipient after they harvested, who are they harvesting for, and then there are reference document numbers, commodity harvested, dates of harvested, amounts harvested. So all that information will be done at the harvest point. If it goes from the field to a cooler before it gets initial packed, in other words, if it gets bulk cooled, well, then there are some key data elements associated with that cooling. The location description of the cooler, the farm that it came from, the recipient, again, then the commodity cooled, the date of cooling, and the amount cooled. So you're starting to see some parallels here. We're always interested in the commodity, the date, the amount, where, and who's getting it next, so that things can be sewn together later. Now, if you can go to the next slide, please. That initial packing event is going to assemble all the information from harvest, and it's going to take all the information from cooling, and it's going to assign a traceability lot code that connects the product description, where it was harvested, where it was cooled, and then the information from this critical tracking event, the date, the amount, and the location of the actual packing event. That information gets passed forward, and the other critical tracking events are shipping, So the packer ships it to somebody, somebody received it. And if there's a transformation step that happens at that step, then additional key data elements are going to be associated with that critical tracking event of transformation, including possibly a new traceability lot code. But the key data elements for these critical tracking events include the data elements associated with this event, which is always going to include the date, the amount, and where, the next receiver, and then some or all of the KDEs from what happened beforehand. So as you can see, this can snowball, right? So let's go ahead and see what Wes has to ask. If harvesting, cooling, and packing takes place on the same farm, is it one log? Or are they going to be held in, or will there be 3 separate reference documents? Angela, I don't know the question to that.
So I think, again, and this kind of goes to what your point was about how we tried to remain a little agnostic on some things. So what we really wanted to do, one, because the statute requires that we do not ask any firm covered by the traceability rule to duplicate their records. So if your firm maintains this information on different documents, then those documents would be satisfying your requirements for the rule. If you choose to do them on one big document, that's fine as well. We really wanted to leave it up to the firms to make a decision on what was easiest for them, so that we weren't really causing them to incur any additional burden by developing different documents or new documentation to comply with the rule. Obviously, you do have to develop the documentation if you're not maintaining the KDEs that you're required for each critical tracking event that you perform. But aside from that, we didn't want to create any additional documentation. So again, if you have it in one document or you have it in multiple documents, if you choose to have a different entity outside of yourself maintain that information for you, that's acceptable as well. Really what it comes down to is when FDA shows up, you have 24 hours to produce that information for us that's requested of you. And so that's regardless of whether you've stored it on site or have another company or a contract with the rest of your growers or harvesters, coolers, for them to maintain that information on their location.
Great, thank you. Anything else on TLC, CTE, and KDE to purposely go into the alphabet soup? All these elements, all this paperwork, all these records are linked together with the traceability lot code. They're required at critical tracking events, and the different elements are called key data elements, and we've listed those key data elements for some of the CTEs that are most relevant to farms in the notes on these slides, so you don't have to guess. I'm going to pause for just a second. Going once, going twice. All right, let's carry on. So in online, FDA has provided us with a scenario where the supply chain is cucumbers. Cucumbers are on the FTL, both as a raw agricultural commodity and as fresh cut fruits and vegetables. So we have the different entities in the supply chain: farms, harvesters, coolers, initial packing, processor, distributor, and retail food establishment. And then here are some of the critical tracking events that are associated with KDEs. And again, noting that farms do not have a critical tracking event unless they're also conducting harvesting, cooling, or initial packing. So one direct question to you all, if you can go to the next slide, Donna, is whether PSA, whether it is useful to take that and say, okay, here's something that is very interesting or very useful for farms to know. All 4 of these first 4 critical tracking events, or events if we include growing, these could all be done by one farm, or they could be done by a contract grower, contract harvester, contract cooler, and then be sold to a packer. So in terms of a farm that is growing or packing, they could be doing one or all of these things. We also noted that these are the things that are critical tracking events, not including growing at the farm. And then here are some of the KDEs that are essential for the different events. Now, these are not KDEs because these are going to be I'm pointing, but you can't see my cursor. The growing information, because it's not a critical tracking event, those are elements that are going to be in the traceability plan, the field ID, the field map, and the field GPS. When the harvester, as our understanding is, when the harvester goes to that field to collect and harvest that information, that product, they also harvest information, to use my own accidental pun, and they're going to grab the growing information in addition to the commodity and the amount that they harvested in the other KDEs. And then it goes on to cooling and packing. Once it gets past packing, we're into the processing, manufacturing, and transportation, and these are things that farms don't do. But so we're going to be interested in hearing your thoughts about whether fleshing this out is a good idea for trainers and for y'all to give it your should we invest our efforts into making sure everything on this is ship shape 100% accurate. Tucker is asking about other commodities added to the traceability list in the future. And I think I know the answer, but I think it's better if you answer it, Angela.
Sure. So we anticipate that we'll be updating the list about every 5 years or so. And so what we'll do is we have a process. We're going to publish the notice in the Federal Register with the proposed changes, allow the public an opportunity to comment on it. And then after that, we'll issue a second Federal Register notice that will state the final decision on what changes were made to the food traceability list. And then any additions to the FTL, they would then become effective 2 years after the second Federal Register notice was posted, unless we state otherwise. And then as far as, I know you asked about additions, but just so that everyone knows, also there is potential for deletion as well. And if an item is deleted from the FTL, that would then become effective immediately.
And Angela, will additions and deletions be done using the same process with that risk? I think it's called a risk prioritization tool. What's that called? Okay.
Yes.
Do you think there's anything that our trainers online ought to know about the process of coming up with the the food traceability list?
I think, it's good to note that Congress gave us a mandate. They required us to have, I believe it was 7 criteria included in that risk ranking model to develop the FTL. So the information that was utilized was what Congress requested that we use to develop it and put the data in. So we often tell industry that if they have additional data that they want to supply to us, that we will take that into consideration as we are going forward with our assessments for the next upcoming FTL.
Thank you. So Donna, let's wrap this up. And Dan, I'll get back to your question. And same with you, Val. Let's go ahead and wrap up so we can get to all the questions because we're so close to the end. We end this with just additional resources. There's a TAN, there's the inquiry form for questions about this. There's the information about, where do I download the food traceability rule? Where do I get the food traceability list? Tommy had already dropped that into the chat. That exemptions and exclusions tool that we referenced on the second or third slide. And then NISDAM had gotten ahead of the curve a little bit and put out some information about produce traceability that we feel is still relevant and important for growers. So let's go to the next slide. And shall we go ahead and take care of Dan's questions and Val's question and then get into this slide, Donna?
Yep, I agree.
Okay.
So I can read Dan's question. Help me. So I think it's a little bit about, help me understand why growing information from the farm isn't included as a KDE. So for example, use of soil amendments, biological soil amendments of animal origin, agricultural water quality, etc.
So the crux of this issue is obviously traceability. And when we were determining what key data elements or KDEs that we felt were important for the specific purpose of traceability, We did not feel that that type of information was useful to get us to the farm. The goal is to get from, the consumer to the farm as quickly as possible. We do think that that information is important, and we know that we can obtain that information for, root cause analysis, so that we can try to determine how and why there was contamination. But as far as using that information to get us from where a person purchased a product to where it was grown or sourced from, we didn't feel that that information was going to give us, get us there any faster.
Thank you. And then Valerie asked a question. What changes to the initial draft were made in response to public comments?
If possible, can you provide some clarification, Valerie, on whether you meant to the rule overall or specific to the FTL list? I can speak kind of generally to the rule overall. I think one of the things that really stood out to us was we received a lot of comments about where information, especially harvesting and cooling and growing information, was being stored. And so we got a lot of feedback that the packing houses or the packers would be the ones that had a lot of the data that we were looking for. And so that's kind of where the development of the initial packer came from, because that was in response to a lot of the comments that we got. We were told that, that's typically where you see that information stored. They would have the best access to that information, and have the most kind of visibility of the supply chain from growing, to that point, growing to the point of packing. So that was one of the bigger changes that we made as a result of comments. Other things such as it relates to the FTL, we tried to clarify the food items that were on there. We got a lot of comments that asked for a more extensive list of food items that were covered under the various categories on the FTL. Obviously, we can't develop an exhaustive list, but we tried our best to make sure that we were specific and provided enough examples so that people had a better context of what was included there. What else? I think for the most part, we did try to format some of the KDEs differently. So we did remove a few KDEs because we got feedback from commenters that they didn't feel like those data elements were as useful, or they were very confusing to capture. So things like time was a big one that we got a lot of comments about. So we removed time as a key data element because we got a lot of feedback about that one and the fluctuations of trying to capture it.
And I do want to just jump in and remind everybody that for example, Valerie had specific questions about differences between the draft rule and the finalized rule. The preamble, that front material to the regulatory language, it kind of goes through a lot of these discussions that Angela just very broadly covered. I found that very helpful. I know the PSA team broke up sections of the preamble to tackle, and I know my section was about the development of the FTL, and I thought it was very helpful in kind of reading through. Yeah, so in case you wanted some written resources to look at.
So Wes wants to confirm that a grower can be qualified exempt from the produce safety rule if they sell 51% direct to consumers and a couple of other things. But let's say, so his question is about the 49%. If a grower sells raw agricultural commodities on the food traceability list wholesale, but they are eligible for a qualified exemption from produce safety rule, do they still have to comply with traceability rule for their wholesale sales?
This is another question that I should probably take back to make sure that I'm answering it appropriately and accurately. But I do believe that it's all sales overall that we're taking into consideration as far as the cutoff. So if you exceed that number, then you will be covered by the rule. And then obviously, if you fall under the cutoff, then you are exempt from the rule.
Yeah, okay. And I was just trying to think of how to summarize it, but I think the answer is yes, Wes. But Angela's going to have to. I guess I just wanted to develop a plan to get the answer to Wes. I guess we'll communicate with you, Angela, and we'll parse out that question and we'll get back an answer.
Yeah, I can, if at the end of this, I can take the questions back that needed some additional follow-up, and then I can send that information to you all, and then you can distribute it appropriately.
Okay, Jeff asks a question. What is required by brokers and other third-party auctions in terminal markets where growers and packers have no control of the transactions and storage?
So again, the rule covers whomever manufacture, process, packs, or holds. So if you hold a food in any capacity that is on the FTL, then you are required to maintain the KDEs or key data elements for each critical tracking event or CTE that you perform. So we did try to make sure, as far as the shipping and receiving KDEs, that they aligned for the most part. So really, if you're receiving a product from an entity that's covered by the rule, you should be receiving a lot of the information that you need to fulfill those requirements. So you shouldn't be really developing anything new. I think, with the exception of the location that you received it, which would obviously be yourself, and then the date that you received it. They can't give you the date. But aside from that, all of the other KDEs would really be covered by the information that you should be getting from the previous source, from the previous person in the supply chain.
Can I will go ahead and try to paraphrase Alex's question, because it's one of my own questions as well. We have contract growers, and the contract grower sells their product on the tree or in the ground. They don't harvest, they don't pack or hold produce. So they're excluded. My understanding is that they are not covered by the traceability rule. Yet there are some data elements that need to get into the supply chain. How does that happen? And Alex, I hope I paraphrased your question well.
So we expect that, if there's a contract grower, contract harvester, again, they are required by the rule to maintain information. Now, if they are doing this under the direction of a brand or a parent company, then we wrote the rule so that there's flexibility, so that those contract harvesters or contract companies can get that information from the parent company, the brand, right? So we understand that a lot of brands obviously have a mix of farms that they own or operations that they own versus operations that they contract out. And so we are not, while we are requiring, how can I say this clear? While we are requiring each contractor performing the activity to have that information, we do understand that the parent company is the one kind of doing the directing of it. And so the contracting firm would be on the hook for the information, but we also are willing to work with the parent company to obtain that data if that's how the information is being passed along.
I think that's actually the source of the confusion, that if they're not covered by the rule, how are they on the hook for the data?
So the data that's required for the rule obviously starts at each point where that entity is covered by the rule, right? So we don't expect KDEs to be available necessarily if those firms are not covered by the rule. We did write a separate list for receiving for after the initial packer. We did write an abbreviated list of requirements for those who are accepting commodities from exempted entities. But as it relates to the earlier in the supply chain, we understand that there may be some complications with that. But again, as I mentioned, everyone is still covered by Subpart J. So whatever your requirements are as it relates to Subpart J, you still have to fulfill those. And then we hope that these entities would have a good enough relationship with their farms or with those contractors in order to obtain the information that they need to fulfill those requirements.
And I hate to burn more time. Could you remind us what Subpart J is?
So subpart J is the Bioterrorism Act from 2002. So
Okay.
there are some traceability requirements within that.
Okay, but farms are excluded from that, are they not?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna tap out. Donna, can you spell me?
Okay, so I think we got through most of the questions in the chat box. Betsy or Don can let me know if we did not. I'm gonna take a look at the slide and just jump in if I left anything out. But here's where we wanted to save some time at the end to ask you all for your input on the slides that Don just presented to you. And I know looking at Nicole's comments, she said some of the slides with examples of these trickier scenarios might be helpful for our trainings. I absolutely agree. I think a lot, since it's so new, every time we get these questions, it's like a brand new question. But asking you all using the chat box, or we can unmute you, what do you think is needed in these supplemental slides? What would you find helpful to see included in these supplemental slides? Realizing that we can't have a comprehensive slide set that covers everything, all the ins and outs of the rule, because they're intended for use in module 7 or even a standalone. It would then be a very long presentation. But what do you think is needed? And is there anything missing? I'll give you all a chance to type in the comments. I'll just run through the list because I do want to make sure we can address each of these questions. Is there anything as Don presented that you thought could be adjusted, either to clarify something that didn't quite align with your understanding when you read through the rule? Or do you have any other input? Please always say the whole phrase, then add the acronym, absolutely. We'll make sure, I know we went back and forth with many of those key data element slides and critical tracking events, trying not to use the acronym because just trying to present it in as clear a fashion as we could. A reminder that this is not a phased in effective date like the PSR. Yes, I think that's great. We had a lot of conversations within the team about that because we're so used to those, those compliance dates by farm size or by business size. I think it needs to be a standalone slide set. This is very complicated for growers. Thanks, Wes. That's a good comment. I don't think.
Wes, this is Betsy. Are you suggesting that we not include these in module 7 or that we make a smaller set?
As Wes types, I assume he's going to type. No, that's a good question. Because Connie said something similar. And I think this is where, at least when we worked on the agricultural water supplemental slides, these types of comments were really helpful because we added a lot of these in the teaching notes. So Connie said, I think this will really overwhelm small and beginning growers at the end of the day. In module 7, I think it might overwhelm anybody, but any plans to also create a fact sheet that they can take home to think this through after the grower training? That's a good comment. An example record that a 40K a year farm might use to be in compliance, clear case studies. I think these are all very, very helpful comments that we can take back.
Some of them I think are going to be aspirational. As we learn more, we'll be able to do these things. And I think we can collaborate with FDA to get some of those done.
Right. And this is Betsy again. I think the other thing is that today a lot of good example questions have been discussed. And if Angela can get feedback and we can turn those into scenarios as examples, that would be good. I also think Wes and I'm going to go with Connie. And then I saw Kristen say they should be optional. All supplemental slides are always optional, but I think we may want to call them down for the module 7 and maybe just make it clear that this is going on, so as not to tip the apple cart at the end of the PSA training.
Absolutely. Okay, so what I'm thinking is, because we want to put some of these, I think, up on the website, maybe we can put up an initial supplemental slide set, and then we can work on developing as we get answers to questions, as we receive more questions, we can work on some of those other documents. I think that's a great point. Okay, I have a few slides that I want to present. We're looking at the clock. So I'm going to move through the others, but anybody else, please feel free to jump in. I will keep an eye out on the chat box as well. But I do want to highlight looking at traceability resources. If you're interested in more discussion of produce traceability, just a reminder, back in November of last year, November 2021, we did an educator's call on traceability. It was not specifically on the FSMA Traceability Rule, but we were sort of looking forward to this topic. This one was titled Produce Traceability, One State's Approach to Approving Traceability Across the Produce Supply Chain. And I just want to put another plug in for that New York State Department of Ag and Markets traceability guidance document, because especially the appendices have a lot of great information. So that whole document is sort of discussed in detail in that educator's call. A reminder that Module 7 has suggestions about defining a lot and creating a lot code as a resource for farms. There are some other resources within those slides. And that just kind of goes back to that discussion that in the final traceability rule, they did not establish a how-to guide on how to create these lot codes. They more established those requirements. And then there are some other industry standard processes for traceability that are in development, and this includes lot codes. So I think there's a lot of work in this sphere. So looking forward to the next year or couple, there are going to be some other resources being developed. I quickly want to highlight our next educator's call. This is more of a to be decided about the dates, but I think many of you in the audience are aware that the compliance dates for the largest farms, for all other businesses, for harvest and post-harvest agricultural water are just around the corner in January of 2023. So I want to put a plug in your ear that we are going to be developing an educator's call series on post-harvest water. So the first one we expect is going to be in January. I will send out information on that as soon as we have it established, but we are looking at doing a series on post-harvest water to highlight some of our outreach efforts and new and updated supporting resources. I also want to mention that the registration is open for the PSA Advanced Trainer Workshop. This is going to be February 7th to 9th in Lake Alfred, Florida. We are hosting that in conjunction with the Southern Center. I think Tommy's probably going to put the link in the chat box, but there is a nice little QR code if you want to take a picture. It'll take you directly to the registration link. And then I think the last announcement that I have from the PSA end is that we are hiring. So if you know of anybody who is interested in working for the Produce Safety Alliance as a Spanish language extension associate, this position description is now live, and the first review will begin January 9th, and we will continue until a suitable candidate is identified. So this position is replacing Ricardo Orellana, who has moved on to a new role. And please contact us with any questions, but we're really excited about having a new person hired to help us with all of our Spanish language outreach. And then lastly, just to show you our new PSA website, this is the migrated version. We have it in English and Spanish, and we also have all of our social media, including the newsletter, listed at the very bottom if you would like to follow us. So with that,
Hey, Donna, this is Betsy. Can I jump in for a second?
Absolutely. I was going to say if there's a chat box.
If you go back to the slide that has the position opening on it, if you could, thank you.
Yes.
Really want to encourage you all, if you could just share this with any colleagues that you think may know people or have people that are interested in this position. I think most of you on this call, if I look at who's on this call, you know what the PSA is, you know what it's about, you know what the expectations are. And you know, we have a lot going on right now with our Spanish language group, and we are really looking for a good person. So anything I can do to encourage you to share it widely with colleagues you think might be interested, we would really appreciate that. And I know that's asking a lot because it's the end of the year and you got a lot of stuff going on, but would really appreciate that. Thank you. Sorry, Donna.
Nope, absolutely. And I am looking at the chat box, and Don can jump in and let me know if I missed anything, but I think a lot of these are pretty complicated responses. So I think this is good to take back as we work on our outreach and potential fact sheet. So is there anything else to answer?
I would, I don't think so. I would just encourage anybody who, and I would be willing to be the conduit. If you feel like these are something needs to be done as it's, knowing that it's a long road to 2026 and we're making steady progress forward. The slide set that we presented to you today, does it meet the expectations or the requirements for useful information today, knowing that we're going to continue to get better over the years? So if you have suggestions about, please don't release this until you include this, please send it through me or Donna.
And I just want to put another, I guess I really appreciate everybody's participation today, because I know we've been bouncing our ideas off of each other within the PSA team. So these questions are really, really helpful. So just really appreciate all of the input in the chat box and all of your questions today to hopefully develop a better product.
And one last thing, I think this is important, and I think this is what Don was trying to get at. Sorry, I'm sick. I think the slides as they are very good. If you have concerns about them, let us know. Otherwise, I think the way to proceed is to get the slides out and then just slowly update them as we get more information. And I'm interested in what Angela thinks too, after having seen them presented, you know, if there's any edits there as well. But as we said at the beginning, as Don said at the beginning, the point is to keep this conversation moving forward, so that we can keep the growers moving forward, our own understanding moving forward, so that we can assist them with getting done what needs done. And I do think there were a lot of really good questions. I saw another comment from Dan in the box. There's some very interesting areas that I think we can get some clarity on that will help all of us. So really appreciate everybody's attendance today. Appreciate Don and Donna stepping in because I was sick today, but thank you to all of you and the great questions in the chat box.
Perfect. Thanks all, and have a really nice holiday season. Happy holidays to everybody, and we will see you in January. Thanks all.